Today in the EU, inside the world of lobbying. Whether you've been lounging on the beach, hiking up mountains, or just relaxing at home, I hope you've made the most out of your time away from Brussels politics. But soon, it's back to business with the new mandate for European institutions. As fresh faces and seasoned politicians step into their roles, many will be vying to secure their influence on the legislation that shapes our future. Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Giada Santana, and this is Today in the EU.
So this is the cozy Mickey Mouse bar.
We took a deep dive into the world of lobbying. From the halls of the parliament.
Since you see it's a bit, you need to get here, it's a bit at the end of the corridors. At the same time, it's a key position because here are many of the offices of the group staff.
To the streets of Brussels.
Along the streets are all lobby offices. Of course, it's very conveniently located, very close to the parliament.
What does lobbying really look like from the inside? And how is it shaping the European Union? To reply to these and other questions, I'm joined in the studio by Vranken, researcher and campaigner at the Corporate Europe Observatory. Bram, let's start with the definition of what lobbying means. How would you define it?
Lobby originally comes from the place where people wanted to influence decision-making, waited for policymakers in the lobby of a hotel. They would physically wait there for the decision-making politician to come out and start talking with them. Of course, since then, lobbying has become way more sophisticated. But generally, it means people who try to influence policymaking, decision-making through various means.
Do you know historically when that was? When lobbyists used to wait in the lobby?
That must be like the 19th century or something, yeah.
Okay. Lately, there has been a lot of talk about influence and how influence has been shaping European institutions. There have been several concerns. What is the connection between the EU institutions and corporate undue influence? You've worked on it quite a bit.
So first of all, to give you an idea about the scale of lobbying in Brussels. So Brussels is the second city in the world in terms of lobbying, just coming after Washington. There are various estimates, but there are around 30,000 lobbyists in Brussels lobbying the EU. That's one lobbyist for every employee of the European Commission.
Wow.
So this is really a large-scale phenomenon, which really has a big impact on EU decision-making. There are a couple of problems with lobbying. So first of all, it is very imbalanced. So if you look at who is lobbying, we see that corporate interests really dominate. And that's in terms of the resources they have, the lobbyists they have, and the access they have to the institutions. That's really dangerous because in some cases it undermines democracy. Because of course the EU should be making policies for 500 million citizens, but if a few corporate interests are able to capture the agenda, then we risk ending up with really bad laws, which might undermine citizens' rights, undermine the public interest.
Precisely about this, what legislation exists to prevent this kind of imbalance and what should be there that is still not there?
So there are various transparency measures or some rules, but overall, this is all very weak. So, for example, we have EU Transparency Register. Whoever lobbies should register them to the Transparency Register, saying how much they spend, their lobbying budget, how much lobbyists the company has, for example, and so on and so forth. But what we have seen is that a lot of companies do not register, and those who register often do not give the correct information. So just to give an example, ASD Europe, which is the umbrella organization for the defense industry, claims to be spending around 300,000 euros each year. But if you look at their accounts in the National Bank of Belgium, where they're registered, they have an annual turnover of 4 million euros a year. So this shows a huge discrepancy between what they report to the Transparency Register and what they're likely really spending on lobbying.
And what consequences are there for this type of actions?
Well, a lack of transparency risks hiding certain interests which are trying to influence EU decision making. And that's a real democratic problem because democracy should be transparent so that we can hold policymakers and other actors accountable. But if there is no transparency, we cannot hold these interests accountable.
Precisely, and this is the objective of Corporate Europe Observatory. What are the three most powerful lobbies on your radar?
These are the companies and sectors which would immediately pop in mind if you think about lobbying. It's, for example, the fossil fuel industry, it's big finance, pharma, and of course, big tech, which really grew in the last couple of years. We've done a lot of research on big tech lobbying and how much they spend on lobbying. And according to our estimates, the tech sector is now spending 130 million euros a year. And Facebook, which is spending the most of all tech companies and actually spending the most of any company in the EU, is spending 9 million euros a year.
9 million euros a year. For Meta, I'm aware it's not a lot, but I'm also wondering, how is the money spent concretely?
First of all, the companies, they have their own small army of lobbyists, but they also often spend building a sort of lobby echo chamber. If Facebook, for example, goes to a policymaker and starts talking about data protection, the policymaker will probably ask some critical questions because everybody knows data privacy and data capture of Facebook is not great. But if you have a think tank or if you have a lobby group presenting SMEs, for example, talking about data privacy, that's a different question. And then the policymaker is more likely to listen to that organization. So we have seen that tech companies, but also other companies in different sectors, often give funding to think tanks, give funding to umbrella organizations, lobby firms, but also sometimes, which is a very unethical way of lobbying, to astroturfing groups, where it is not immediately clear that they represent big tech companies, but it seems like they're representing small and medium enterprises or citizen groups or other interests.
It is my understanding that foreign governments have also employed the same method, funding from the outside, think tanks, NGOs. That happened with Qatar, Russia, and now China. What is the risk there?
So Qatargate, of course, has shown what the risk is. So Qatargate is the biggest corruption scandal ever to hit the European Parliament, with 1.5 million euros found in cash and suitcases. That is a really stunning example of corruption, which you would only imagine to see in movies or on television. But this corruption scandal has really rocked the European Parliament, but it was a long way coming. As we have been able to document for years, due to the lack of transparency, foreign governments are able to find avenues to steer EU policymaking. And before Qatargate, there was already a big scandal on Azerbaijan, which employed so-called caviar diplomacy, where they would invite politicians from all across the world on luxury trips to Azerbaijan. And often these politicians, after these luxury trips, became more friendly to the regime. And also MEPs were involved in those kinds of trips. They even visited Nagorno-Karabakh, which is the contested region between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And some of these MEPs changed their opinion on Azerbaijan, on the regime, following such trips. So that shows that Qatargate is not just an isolated incident. It's really structural, and it is because of the lack of transparency, but also this ecosystem of lobby organizations, which is present in Brussels and which is very easy to use for anybody who wants to make use of them.
Because of these concerns, there has been a lot of talks about creating an ethics body that could monitor the behavior of EU politicians. What do you think about it?
So the ethics body is a good step, but it lacks investigative body and it lacks enforcement. And that is a common thread in all the measures taken by the EU. So if we look at the EU Transparency Register, it's not mandatory, it's not enforceable. If we look at the European Ombudsman, it takes really good decisions, but those decisions are not enforceable. So every time there is a scandal, we see that there is a momentum for changing the rules, and the rules are changed to a certain extent, but very quickly there is a backlash against anything which could have any real teeth. And that's also what we've seen with Qatargate, where there was real momentum to finally change the rules, to finally have something which is enforceable. But again, really already after a month, we saw there were already the first signs of a backlash against anything which could be mandatory or could be enforceable.
And for our listeners, I can imagine, so what can we do? What can people do as citizens?
We have some very clear ideas of what should happen. And I think the transparency register should be mandatory. No question about it. There should be more enforcement of the rules which are already in place, and in some cases we should limit the access of corporate lobbies to EU policymakers, because now it's a free to all. The one with the most resources, the most access, is able to steer decisions most. So money, in a way, buys influence and power. That should not be the case. So we need a more balanced system where the EU policymakers reach out to voices within society who are at the moment not being heard, going from communities to academics to NGOs, so that decision-making and input into decision-making is structured on a more balanced basis.
Thank you, Bram. I'm Giada Santana, and this was Euractivist Today in the EU podcast. Visit Euractivist to stay on top of the latest news, sign up for our podcast newsletter, and if you haven't subscribed yet, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever it is that you get your podcasts. Leave us a star review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite streaming platform. It will really help us spread the word about our work. This episode was produced by Miriam Sanz de Tejada, Nicoletta Yonta, and me. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.